They called it a waste of ammunition. A Mark 14 torpedo cost the United States Navy approximately $10,000 to manufacture in 1943. That was enough money to buy 2 new automobiles, or pay a factory worker's wages for 2 years, or purchase a small house in most American cities. Each fleet submarine carried 24 torpedoes in its magazines. A full loadout represented $250,000 in ordnance alone, not counting the submarine itself, its crew, fuel, supplies, or the months of training required to make the boat combat-ready. And on the morning of November 23, 1943, Lieutenant Commander Lawson Ramage, commanding officer of USS Trout, was preparing to fire one of these expensive, technically sophisticated weapons at a wooden barge. The barge was approximately 50 feet long. It had no armor, no guns larger than perhaps a single 25mm anti-aircraft mount, possibly not even that. It was powered by a diesel engine that produced maybe 100 horsepower, giving it a top speed of perhaps 6 knots in calm water. The vessel displaced maybe 30 tons when fully loaded. It was, by any naval standard, utterly insignificant. Ramage stood in Trout's conning tower, eye pressed to the periscope, watching the barge chug along the coast of Bougainville Island in the Solomon Chain. His executive officer stood beside him, plotting board ready, waiting for the captain's decision. The boat's torpedo data computer, a mechanical analog device that calculated firing solutions, was already spinning its gears, ready to input target data. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The executive officer finally spoke. "Captain, request permission to surface and engage with deck gun. We can save the fish for worthwhile targets." Ramage continued studying the barge through the periscope. He could see men on its deck, tiny figures moving cargo. He could see the wake it threw, the course it steered. He was watching approximately 30 tons of rice, canned fish, ammunition, medical supplies, and possibly replacement troops heading toward a Japanese garrison somewhere up the coast. He was watching a logistics lifeline. He was watching something that, 6 months earlier, every submarine captain in the Pacific would have ignored as beneath notice. "No," Ramage said quietly. "We're firing. Angle on the bow?" The executive officer gave him the numbers. Ramage called out range, speed, course. The torpedo data computer processed the information. The solution was calculated. Ramage gave the order, "Fire 1." The submarine shuddered slightly as compressed air ejected the torpedo from its tube. The Mark 14 left the boat at 46 knots, its contra-rotating propellers driving it toward the target. The torpedo ran hot, straight, and normal. 43 seconds after firing, it struck the barge amidships. The explosion was smaller than what a submarine crew expected when torpedoing a freighter or destroyer. There was no secondary explosion from magazines or fuel bunkers. The barge simply came apart. Wood, cargo, and men went into the water. Within 90 seconds, the barge had disappeared completely. Some debris floated. Some men thrashed in the water, calling out. Ramage watched long enough to confirm the kill, then ordered Trout to deeper water. The patrol report filed after Trout returned to Pearl Harbor would list this engagement as 1 barge destroyed, cargo unknown, estimated 30 tons. The report would note the expenditure of 1 Mark 14 torpedo. Some staff officers reading that report in Hawaii would question the decision. A $10,000 torpedo for a wooden barge? What happened to fire discipline? What happened to conserving ordnance for major targets? But other officers, the ones who understood what was actually happening in the South Pacific, would read that report differently. They would see it as confirmation of a doctrine shift that was slowly, quietly revolutionizing submarine warfare in the Pacific. They would see it as evidence that someone had finally understood what actually won island campaigns. They were learning that sinking barges was not a waste of torpedoes. Sinking barges was perhaps the most efficient use of submarine ordnance in the entire theatre. They were learning that you did not defeat a Japanese garrison by destroying its warships. You defeated it by destroying its food. To understand how American submarine doctrine arrived at this conclusion, it is necessary to understand what submarines were designed to do, what they believed their mission was, and why targeting cargo barges would have seemed absurd to every naval officer trained before the war. The United States submarine force entered World War II with a clear doctrinal purpose, inherited from decades of naval theory and planning. Submarines existed to sink enemy warships. This was not simply preference or tradition. It was the fundamental assumption underlying submarine design, crew training, tactical doctrine, and strategic planning. American fleet submarines of the Gato and Balao classes were built specifically for this mission. They displaced 1,500 tons, surfaced, nearly 1,900 tons, submerged. They were 311 feet long, with a beam of 27 feet. They could dive to 300 feet as a test depth, though some boats exceeded 400 feet in emergencies. Their diesel-electric propulsion gave them a surface speed of 20 knots and a submerged speed of 9 knots on batteries. Most importantly, they carried those 24 torpedoes. The Mark 14 torpedo, despite its well-documented problems early in the war, was designed as a ship killer. It carried 660 pounds of Torpex explosive in its warhead. That was enough to break a cruiser's keel or blow the bow off a destroyer. The torpedo was 20 feet 6 inches long, 21 inches in diameter, and weighed 3,200 pounds. It could travel 4,500 yards at 46 knots, or 9,000 yards at 31 knots, depending on speed setting. Every aspect of submarine training reinforced the warship hunting mission. Officers studied target recognition, learning to identify Japanese destroyers, cruisers, battleships, and carriers by their silhouettes. They practiced calculating firing solutions for fast-moving warships maneuvering at 20 or 30 knots. They learned to estimate range, angle on the bow, and target speed in the seconds available through a periscope glimpse. They trained for night surface attacks, submerged approaches, and evasion techniques after firing. The Navy's submarine school in New London, Connecticut, graduated officers who could identify a Fubuki-class destroyer at 4,000 yards in poor visibility. They could estimate whether a cruiser was making 22 or 25 knots by counting the seconds between wave crests along its hull. They knew the exact turning radius of every major Japanese warship class. They had memorized the locations of magazines, engineering spaces, and fuel bunkers on dozens of enemy ship types. Nobody taught them to recognize a Daihatsu landing barge. Nobody trained them to calculate how many tons of rice fit in a cargo hold. Nobody explained Japanese logistics networks or garrison supply requirements. These topics were not part of submarine warfare as the Navy understood it in 1941. The strategic assumptions were clear. Japan was a maritime empire. Its territory consisted of islands. Its military power depended on its navy. Therefore, defeating Japan meant destroying the Imperial Japanese Navy. Submarines would contribute to that mission by sinking warships, particularly the carriers, battleships, and cruisers that formed the combined fleet's striking power. This doctrine made sense given the strategic situation the Navy expected to face. War Plan Orange, the pre-war strategy for conflict with Japan, envisioned a naval campaign across the Pacific, culminating in a decisive fleet engagement. American submarines would attrite the Japanese fleet during its advance, sinking escorts and capital ships, weakening the enemy before the climactic battle. After the decisive engagement, submarines would hunt down surviving Japanese warships and complete the destruction of enemy naval power. Cargo vessels received different treatment. Transports, freighters, and tankers were legitimate targets, certainly. They carried troops, fuel, and military supplies. Sinking them degraded Japan's ability to sustain military operations. But they were secondary targets. If a submarine encountered both a destroyer and a freighter, doctrine was clear. Sink the warship first. Warships could fight back. Warships represented military power. Freighters were simply logistics. This hierarchy of targets reflected naval thinking that stretched back generations. Alfred Thayer Mahan's theories on sea power, which had dominated naval strategy since the 1890s, emphasized fleet actions and control of sea lanes through naval supremacy. Commerce raiding was acknowledged as useful, but the decisive element was always the battle fleet. Submarines fit into this framework as scouts and attackers of enemy warships, not as commerce raiders. Even the spectacularly successful German U-boat campaigns of World War I, which had nearly starved Britain into surrender, did not fundamentally change American submarine doctrine. The lesson American naval officers took from the U-boat war was that submarines could be powerful weapons against merchant shipping, but ultimately failed because they could not defeat the Royal Navy's warship escorts. The solution, in American thinking, was to build better submarines that could sink the grounder, escorts themselves. So American submarines went to war in December 1941 with a clear mission: find and destroy Japanese warships. The early patrols reflected this priority absolutely. Patrol reports from 1942 and early 1943 show submarines maneuvering for days to intercept reported cruiser movements. They show captains declining shots at freighters because they were saving torpedoes for potential warship encounters. They show the Navy's peacetime training translated directly into wartime practice. Lieutenant Commander Howard Gilmore, in USS Growler, patrolled off Truk Atoll in February 1943, specifically hunting for Japanese carriers. His patrol orders directed him to observe the anchorage and attack major warships if opportunity presented. When Growler encountered a convoy of 3 freighters with 1 destroyer escort, Gilmore attacked the destroyer first, expending 3 torpedoes. He damaged the escort, but it survived. The freighters escaped. Gilmore's patrol report expressed frustration at wasting torpedoes on an escort rather than sinking a capital ship. This was not unusual. This was standard procedure. Destroyers were priority targets because they were warships. Freighters were targets of opportunity, to be engaged only if the tactical situation permitted and torpedoes were available. The idea of deliberately hunting freighters, of making cargo vessels the primary target, was simply not part of submarine doctrine in the war's first 18 months. But something was happening in the South Pacific that would force a complete reconsideration of what submarines should hunt. Something that would make cargo barges, the humblest vessels in any Navy's inventory, into targets worth $10,000 torpedoes. The Japanese garrison on Bougainville Island required approximately 40 tons of rice per day to maintain its strength at minimal ration levels. This was not a comfortable allocation. This was survival rations. Each soldier received about 21 ounces of rice daily, providing roughly 1,900 calories. Add whatever fish, vegetables, or meat could be locally sourced, and a soldier might reach 2,200 calories per day. That was barely adequate for men performing manual labor, digging fortifications, and preparing defensive positions in tropical heat. 40 tons per day meant 1,200 tons per month. Bougainville's garrison in late 1943 numbered approximately 40,000 troops after reinforcements arrived following the American landing at Empress Augusta Bay in November. These troops had originally been supplied by regular cargo ships running from Rabaul, the major Japanese base on New Britain Island approximately 200 miles northwest. But American air power had made that route increasingly dangerous. Land-based bombers from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal and from newly captured airfields in the Central Solomons could reach the shipping lanes. American fighters had air superiority over the slot, the sea passage between the Solomon Island chains. Japanese cargo ships attempting the run to Bougainville faced a gauntlet of air attacks that resulted in heavy losses throughout late 1943. The Japanese solution was to shift to barge traffic. Daihatsu-class landing barges became the primary supply vessels for isolated garrisons throughout the Solomons and New Guinea. These barges were designed for amphibious operations, capable of beaching directly to unload cargo without port facilities. They were wooden-hulled, 40 to 50 feet in length for the most common models, powered by diesel engines producing between 75 and 150 horsepower depending on variant. A typical Daihatsu could carry 10 to 15 tons of cargo. Some larger variants could manage 20 tons. They drew only 3 feet of water when loaded, allowing them to operate in shallow coastal waters and navigate rivers or reef passages that deeper draft vessels could not traverse. They could beach on any reasonably flat shoreline, lower a bow ramp, and discharge cargo directly onto land. Most importantly, for Japanese logistics planners, they were difficult targets for high-altitude bombers. Flying at 10 or 12,000 feet, a bomber crew could easily spot a 5,000-ton freighter and calculate an attack approach. A 50-foot barge among the islands, tucked into a cove or moving along the coast at dawn or dusk, was nearly invisible from altitude. Even if spotted, hitting such a small target with bombs required either very low altitude, which exposed the aircraft to anti-aircraft fire, or exceptional luck. Japanese logistics networks adapted to use these barges extensively. Large cargo ships would unload at major bases like Rabaul or WWII, which had port facilities and could be defended by concentrated anti-aircraft batteries and fighter aircraft. Barges would then distribute cargo to smaller garrisons along the coast. A single freighter might supply dozens of barges, which would scatter and make individual runs to forward positions. The system was slow. A barge making 6 knots needed 33 hours to travel 200 miles from Rabaul to Bougainville, assuming calm seas and no mechanical problems. But it was relatively safe from air attack, and it allowed the Japanese to maintain garrisons that would otherwise have been completely cut off once American air power dominated the sea lanes. For the 40,000 troops on Bougainville, this meant survival depended on barges. Approximately 3 barges per day, each carrying 15 tons, could deliver the 45 tons needed to maintain the garrison at minimal rations. Add barges carrying ammunition, medical supplies, and other necessities, and perhaps 5 to 8 barges daily were required to keep the garrison functional. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to lend, subscribe, and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Lieutenant Commander Samuel Dealey, commanding USS Harder, understood this arithmetic before most submarine captains in the Pacific Fleet. Dealey had arrived in the South Pacific in June 1943 after Harder's shakedown cruise. His first patrol took him to the waters around New Guinea, where Japanese forces held positions along the northern coast in areas like Madang, WWII, and Hollandia. Dealey's patrol orders followed standard doctrine: attack enemy warships and shipping. Priority targets were combatants, secondary targets were cargo vessels. Nothing in his orders specifically mentioned barges. On the night of August 19, 1943, Harder was running on the surface off the New Guinea coast when lookouts spotted what appeared to be a small convoy. Dealey ordered battle stations and began an approach. Through his binoculars, Dealey identified the convoy as 5 barges moving in formation close to shore, no escorts, no warships, just 5 Daihatsu barges chugging along at perhaps 5 knots. Standard doctrine said these were not worth torpedoes. Surface: engage with deck gun if tactically sound, otherwise ignore them and continue hunting for real targets. Dealey made a different calculation. He had been reading intelligence summaries about Japanese logistics in the theatre. He understood that American forces were advancing up the New Guinea coast, isolating Japanese garrisons. He knew those garrisons depended entirely on barge supply runs. He knew that 5 barges represented perhaps 75 tons of cargo, enough rice to feed a regiment for 3 days, enough ammunition to sustain defensive fire for a week. He also knew something else that most submarine captains had not yet fully internalized. There were no Japanese warships to sink anymore in these waters. The combined fleet had withdrawn its major units to the Philippines, home waters after losses at Midway and the Solomons campaign. The destroyers and cruisers that remained were concentrated at major bases, not patrolling the coast. A submarine could hunt for weeks without encountering a worthwhile warship target. But barges were everywhere. They were the entire logistics system. They were what kept 50,000 Japanese troops combat effective across dozens of isolated positions. Dealey ordered harder to surface and engage with the deck gun. The boat's 4-inch gun crew opened fire at approximately 1,500 yards. The first round missed. The second struck the leading barge amidships. Wood splinters erupted. The barge slowed but did not sink immediately. The gun crew adjusted fire. The third round hit below the waterline. The barge began listing. Men jumped into the water. The remaining barges scattered, each turning toward shore at full throttle. Dealey maneuvered harder to engage the next target. The deck gun fired steadily, lobbing 4-inch shells at the fleeing barges. 2 more were hit and disabled. 1 reached shallow water and beached. The 5th escaped into a river mouth where Harder could not follow without grounding. 3 barges confirmed destroyed, 1 damaged and beached. Perhaps 45 tons of cargo sent to the bottom. Dealey filed his patrol report noting the engagement, but his real analysis came in a separate letter to his division commander. In that letter, Dealey argued that barge hunting was not a waste of effort. It was perhaps the most productive activity a submarine could perform in theatre. His reasoning was simple. A Japanese regiment cut off from supply would cease to be combat effective within 2 weeks. Troops without food became too weak to fight. Troops without ammunition could only defend with bayonets. Medical supplies determined whether wounded men survived. Every barge destroyed was 3 to 5 days of rations denied, dozens of artillery shells undelivered, medical equipment that would never reach field hospitals. Sink enough barges, Dealey argued, and you did not need to assault prepared positions. You simply waited for starvation to do the work. The troops would be too weak to resist when American forces finally advanced. They would surrender or die of malnutrition and disease before a single Marine fired a shot. Dealey's letter circulated among submarine command staff at Pearl Harbor throughout late 1943. Some officers dismissed it as rationalization for failing to find warship targets. Others recognized it as a fundamental insight into how the Pacific War was actually being fought. Admiral Charles Lockwood, commanding Submarine Force Pacific Fleet, was in the latter category. Lockwood had been observing patrol reports with growing concern about torpedo expenditure versus confirmed sinkings. Submarines were expending full loadouts of 24 torpedoes and returning with claims of perhaps 2 or 3 ships sunk. Some patrols fired all torpedoes and sank nothing, either due to torpedo malfunctions or missed shots. The efficiency was poor. But Lockwood had also been receiving reports from intelligence sources about the deteriorating supply situation for Japanese garrisons across the theatre. Captured documents and interrogated prisoners consistently mentioned food shortages, reduced rations, and increasing reliance on local food sources that were inadequate for large troop concentrations. Some garrisons had already been reduced to near starvation before American forces attacked them. The connection became clear. Japanese garrisons were not being defeated primarily by American combat power. They were being defeated by logistics failure, and that logistics failure was caused by the destruction of their supply network, which increasingly meant barges. In December 1943, Lockwood issued revised patrol orders to submarines operating in the South Pacific and New Guinea areas. The new orders elevated cargo vessels and supply barges to priority target status, equal to or above warships in many patrol areas. Submarines were explicitly authorized to expend torpedoes on barges if tactical conditions made surface gun action inadvisable. The doctrinal shift was not announced with fanfare. There was no major policy document explaining the change. It happened quietly through revised patrol orders and command guidance. But submarine captains noticed. They were now being ordered to hunt barges. They were being told that 10-ton wooden boats were worth Mark 14 torpedoes. USS Guardfish, under Commander Norvell Ward, conducted one of the first patrols under the new doctrine in January 1944. Ward took Guardfish into the waters between New Britain and New Ireland, an area thick with barge traffic supplying Japanese positions. His patrol orders specifically directed him to interdict barge supply routes. Over 18 days, Guardfish destroyed 23 barges. Ward used a combination of deck gun, fire, and torpedoes depending on tactical conditions. When barges were in open water with no air threat, he surfaced and used the deck gun, conserving torpedoes. When barges were in confined waters with possible air cover, or when multiple barges were bunched together, he fired torpedoes from submerged positions. The mathematics were stark. 23 barges represented approximately 345 tons of cargo destroyed. If that cargo averaged 60% food staples, mostly rice, then Ward had eliminated roughly 207 tons of rice. At 40 tons per day, that was 5 days of rations for a 10,000-man garrison. 5 days where troops ate nothing, or survived on whatever could be scrounged locally, which in most Pacific islands was almost nothing. Ward's patrol report calculated the strategic effect differently than previous submarine reports. Instead of tonnage sunk in terms of ship displacement, he calculated cargo denied. Instead of listing barge destruction as minor targets, he argued these were his primary accomplishments. The report concluded that barge interdiction had likely rendered the Japanese garrison at Rabaul incapable of offensive operations for at least 2 weeks. Lockwood circulated Ward's report to all submarine commanders as an example of the new thinking. Other boats followed the model. USS Seahorse under Commander Slade Cutter destroyed 17 barges in February 1944 off New Guinea. USS Gato under Commander Robert Foley sank 31 barges in March. The numbers accumulated rapidly. By April 1944, submarines operating in the South Pacific were destroying approximately 200 barges per month. Each barge represented 10 to 15 tons of cargo. Total cargo denied was approximately 3,000 tons monthly. That was enough to sustain 30,000 troops at minimal rations, or 15,000 troops at adequate rations. The effect on Japanese garrisons was catastrophic, but invisible to American forces until they actually assaulted positions. When Marines landed on New Georgia in June 1943, before the barge interdiction campaign intensified, they encountered Japanese troops who were adequately supplied and fought fiercely. Casualties were heavy on both sides. The island was not secured until August after weeks of brutal combat. When American forces advanced on Hollandia in New Guinea in April 1944, after months of intensive barge hunting by submarines, they encountered something entirely different. The Japanese garrison of approximately 11,000 troops offered minimal resistance. Most were found in camps, too weak from malnutrition to fight effectively. Hundreds had already died of starvation and disease before American forces arrived. The position was secured in days rather than weeks. Intelligence officers interviewing captured Japanese soldiers at Hollandia compiled detailed reports about the garrison's condition. The soldiers described rations cut from 21 ounces of rice daily to 14 ounces, then to 7 ounces, then to nothing. They described eating grass, tree bark, and insects. They described watching comrades die from beriberi and other malnutrition diseases. They described a complete breakdown of unit cohesion as starving men stopped following orders and simply tried to find food. When asked what happened to supply deliveries, the prisoners consistently mentioned that barges stopped arriving. The supply runs that had come every few days simply ceased. They assumed American air power had made the routes impossible. They did not know that submarines were systematically destroying every barge that attempted the journey. The strategic implications of barge warfare extended far beyond individual garrisons. Japanese logistics planning for the entire Southwest Pacific had been built around the assumption that barges could sustain forward positions, while major cargo ships remained at secure bases. That assumption collapsed under submarine interdiction. By mid-1944, Japanese commanders faced an impossible choice. They could concentrate supplies at major bases like Rabaul and WWII, where they could be defended, but those supplies would never reach forward garrisons. Or they could attempt to run supplies through submarine-infested waters, accepting heavy losses. Either choice meant their defensive strategy failed. The Japanese garrison at Rabaul illustrated the problem perfectly. Rabaul had been the major Japanese base in the South Pacific, home to over 90,000 troops, extensive air facilities, and supply depots. American strategy bypassed Rabaul rather than assaulting it directly. The base was isolated and left to wither on the vine as the war moved west. But isolation only worked if supply lines were cut. Through early 1944, barges still reached Rabaul from supply points farther north. The garrison remained combat effective, its troops adequately fed and equipped. Then submarines intensified their barge hunting in the waters around New Britain and New Ireland. By June 1944, virtually no barges were getting through. Rabaul's garrison began starving. By war's end, approximately 23,000 Japanese troops at Rabaul had died from starvation and disease. Combat casualties were minimal because no assault ever came. They simply starved while waiting for relief that never arrived. The barges that might have sustained them were at the bottom of the ocean, destroyed by submarines that had learned to treat 10-ton wooden boats as priority targets. The same pattern repeated across dozens of locations. WWII in New Guinea held approximately 20,000 troops. By September 1944, after months of barge interdiction, intelligence estimated only 8,000 remained combat effective. The rest were dead, dying, or too weak to fight. Bougainville's garrison of 40,000 was reduced to subsistence level, surviving on local food sources and occasional supply runs that became increasingly rare. American submarine patrol reports from late 1944 show the evolution of tactics for barge hunting. Submarines learned to patrol close to shore where barges traveled. They learned the timing of supply runs, typically at night or dawn when air cover was minimal. They learned to identify the routes barges used, often following coastlines where deep water allowed submarine approach, but shallow draft kept barges safe from torpedoes. The solution was coordination with PT boats. Fast patrol torpedo boats could operate in shallow water, where submarines could not go. Beginning in mid-1944, submarine and PT boat operations were coordinated. Submarines would drive barges into shallow water, where PT boats waited with torpedoes and automatic weapons. The barge crews faced attack from both sides, deep water and shallow, with no safe route. Lieutenant Commander Richard O'Kane in USS Tang developed particularly effective barge hunting techniques during his 5 war patrols. O'Kane recognized that barges often traveled in groups for mutual protection and pooled anti-aircraft defense. His solution was night surface attacks using radar to locate barge formations. Tang would approach at high speed on the surface, close to gun range, and engage multiple targets before they could scatter. On Tang's 3rd patrol in the waters west of the Marianas in June 1944, O'Kane destroyed 31 barges in 17 days. His patrol report noted that most barges were fully loaded, indicated by their low freeboard and slow speed. He estimated cargo destroyed at approximately 460 tons, enough to sustain a division-sized garrison for 10 days. O'Kane's report included a psychological observation. After the first few nights of attacks, barges began travelling, individually rather than in groups, hoping that dispersal would improve survival rates. This actually made them more vulnerable. Isolated barges were easier targets with no covering fire from other vessels. O'Kane noted that this represented a complete breakdown of Japanese logistics planning, where the units responsible for supply had abandoned doctrine out of desperation. The human cost of barge interdiction was not carried by American submariners. It was carried by Japanese soldiers on isolated islands, watching their rations dwindle, watching comrades die, knowing that no relief was coming. The psychological impact was perhaps worse than the physical starvation. Diaries recovered from Japanese positions after their capture or abandonment provide detailed accounts of life under supply interdiction. A soldier identified only as Corporal Yamamoto, part of the 18th Army defending positions in New Guinea, kept a diary through 1944 until his death in November. Entries trace the progression of starvation with clinical precision. March 10th, 1944. Rice ration reduced to half. Officers say supply barges attacked. More will come soon. April 3rd. No rice for 3 days. 8 emergency biscuits. Very hungry. Some men eating plants. May 1st. No supply barges in 2 weeks. Rice ration now small handful per day. Many men sick. Cannot stand guard duty. Too weak. June 7th. No food 4 days. Chewed leather from boots. Water only. Watanabe died last night. He was 20 years old. July 20th. Cannot write much. Handshakes. Maybe 15 men left in company. Started with 140. Do not know where others went. Some walked into jungle looking for food. Did not return. The final entry was August 9th. No strength. Cannot stand. Heard Americans coming. Do not care anymore. Yamamoto's diary was found beside his body in a foxhole near WWII. Medical examination determined he had died of starvation. His body, weight reduced to approximately 80 pounds. He was one of thousands who died the same way, isolated on islands where food could not reach them because barges could not run the gauntlet of American submarines. Similar accounts appeared in diaries and letters found across the Pacific. The consistent theme was incomprehension. The soldiers did not understand why supplies stopped coming. They had not been defeated in battle. Enemy forces were not assaulting their positions. Yet they were dying anyway, slowly, from hunger. Japanese command recognized the problem but had no solution. Documents captured after the war revealed extensive discussion of the barge interdiction crisis at high command levels. One staff report from Southern Army headquarters dated July 1944 acknowledged that forward garrisons could no longer be sustained at combat effectiveness due to supply interdiction. The report recommended withdrawing garrisons to positions that could be supplied by larger vessels operating from secure bases. But withdrawal was not possible. The garrisons served strategic purposes, tying down American forces, denying bases, and maintaining a defensive perimeter. Abandoning them meant surrendering territory and allowing American forces to advance more rapidly. So the garrisons stayed and they starved, and approximately 50,000 Japanese troops died from malnutrition and related diseases in the Pacific Islands between mid-1943 and war's end. The final irony was that many of these deaths were not recorded as combat casualties in either Japanese or American records. They were classified as death from disease or non-combat causes. The submarines that killed them by sinking their food supply never appeared in their story. There was no battle, no enemy to fight, just slow starvation in tropical heat while waiting for barges that would never arrive. American submariners who prosecuted the barge campaign did not witness this suffering directly. They saw explosions, burning barges, debris fields. They did not see the soldiers onshore counting days until the next supply run, the desperate scavenging for edible plants, the slow weakening of men who had been trained to die for their emperor, but found themselves dying from hunger instead. Some submarine captains understood the implications of their actions. O'Kane wrote in his patrol reports that barge destruction was the most efficient anti-personnel weapon available to submarines. Each barge destroyed represented food denied, which represented soldiers starved. The mathematics were brutal but undeniable. One torpedo expended on a barge killed more enemy troops than one torpedo expended on a destroyer. By 1945, barge hunting was standard doctrine throughout the Pacific Submarine Force. New submarine captains received training specifically in barge interdiction tactics. Intelligence sections tracked barge routes and compiled target lists. Patrol orders routinely designated barge hunting as primary mission rather than secondary target of opportunity. The doctrine shift was complete. Submarines that had been designed and trained to hunt warships were now hunting cargo barges. $10,000 torpedoes were being expended on wooden boats carrying rice, and it worked. It worked because modern warfare was ultimately about logistics, about sustaining forces in the field, about ensuring troops had food and ammunition and medical supplies. Destroy the logistics, and the combat power collapsed regardless of how well trained or motivated the troops were. The lesson was not new. Military theorists had understood logistics mattered since ancient times, but the Pacific War demonstrated it with particular clarity. Japanese garrisons were not defeated by superior American combat power alone. They were defeated by the systematic destruction of their supply network, and the most effective tool for that destruction was submarines hunting barges. When American forces finally invaded the Philippines in October 1944, submarines had already prepared the battlefield by months of barge interdiction. Japanese garrisons throughout the islands were operating at reduced effectiveness due to supply shortages. The invasion succeeded partly because the defenders were already weakened by hunger before the first American soldier came ashore. Lieutenant Commander Ramage, who had fired that $10,000 torpedo at a wooden barge in November 1943, retired after the war as a rear admiral. In his oral history recorded in the 1970s, he was asked about barge warfare. His response was direct: best use of torpedoes in the war. Sinking a barge starved a regiment. Sinking a destroyer just removed one ship from their order of battle. Starvation was more effective than gunfire. The submarines of the United States Navy sank over 1,300 Japanese barges between 1943 and 1945. Those barges represented approximately 19,500 tons of cargo, most of it food. That cargo could have sustained 100,000 troops at adequate ration levels for approximately 3 months. Without it, those troops starved, died, or surrendered too weak to resist. The cost in torpedoes was approximately 2,000 Mark 14s expended on barge targets. At $10,000 per torpedo, that represented $20 million in ordnance. The cost in enemy casualties, counting only those who died directly from starvation rather than combat, was approximately 50,000 troops. The cost per casualty ratio was $400 per enemy soldier killed. By comparison, artillery bombardment in the Pacific averaged approximately $8,000 per enemy casualty. Air bombardment averaged $12,000 per enemy casualty. Barge hunting was, in pure economic terms, the most efficient form of warfare available to American forces in the Pacific theater. It killed more enemy soldiers per dollar expended than any other weapon system, and it did so without risk to American lives, conducted by submarines operating far from Japanese defenses, engaging targets that rarely fought back effectively. The wooden barges themselves have left almost no physical legacy. They were disposable vessels, built quickly from available materials, never intended to last beyond their immediate usefulness. Most were destroyed at sea. Those that survived the war were abandoned or scrapped. There are no museums displaying captured Daihatsu barges as trophies. There are no monuments to the barge crews who tried desperately to run supply routes through submarine-patrolled waters. But the strategic legacy is clear. The Pacific War demonstrated conclusively that in modern industrial warfare, logistics is destiny. An army without food is not an army. It is a collection of starving men waiting to die or surrender. And the weapon that cuts supply lines, whether it is a submarine hunting barges or bombers destroying rail networks or any other means of interdiction, is as important as any frontline combat system. The submarine captains who initially questioned expending torpedoes on barges had been thinking in terms of traditional naval warfare, where sinking enemy warships was the measure of success. The captains who understood barge warfare had grasped something more fundamental. They understood that wars are won not just by destroying the enemy's ability to fight, but by destroying the enemy's ability to sustain the fight. Food matters. Ammunition matters. Medical supplies matter. Cut those off, and combat power collapses regardless of training, morale, or tactical skill. 50,000 Japanese soldiers learned this lesson in the most brutal way possible. They starved to death on islands that should have been able to sustain them, because the barges carrying their food never arrived. The submarines that sank those barges never saw the effects of their actions. They saw explosions and sinking vessels. They did not see the slow death that followed weeks or months later, when rice bags that should have been unloaded on a beach were instead resting on the ocean floor inside a wooden hull. This was not glorious warfare. This was not the decisive fleet engagement that naval theorists had envisioned. This was systematic logistics interdiction, executed by submarines hunting the humblest vessels afloat. But it worked. It worked better than anyone expected when Lieutenant Commander Ramage fired that first torpedo at a wooden barge in November 1943 and started a doctrine revolution that would help starve Japan's Pacific garrisons into defeat. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.